This week we are looking at the poem by Wilfred Owen called Exposure. And one of the things that I've talked about in my previous videos about war photographer and poppies is the idea that they are from the point of view of people who are affected by war but not in war themselves, in the way that we think of in terms of soldiers. So we've got the photographer who's this kind of invisible presence, and we've got the mother who is left at home while her son goes to war. So the first place that I want to begin our analysis with is the representation of soldiers in war and the stereotypes that we associate with soldiers. So first words that come into my mind are things like heroism, courage, strength and power. And Wilfred Owen, as a soldier, actually helps us to see how some of those things aren't necessarily true. We might associate soldiers with courage, but a lot of the ideas in his poem would perhaps lead us to question whether or not men going off to fight in wars is something which we should kind of celebrate and see as strong and powerful and kind of worthy, or whether or not actually it's kind of futile and it is illogical for these men to go and be treated like cannon fodder. So that stereotype of the soldier is something that actually in this poem is taken on not necessarily by the soldiers themselves, but all of those stereotypes, that kind of violence and the idea of being an enemy or attacking is assumed by the role of the weather. So rather than the soldiers in this poem sort of talking about fighting other soldiers and other men, it's about the men against forces of nature. And the idea that these men are fighting a bigger war than just the battle on that field is really important, because Wilfred Owen wants us to kind of so think about questions about the way that war has an impact on religious belief and the way that war impacts what we think about politics as well. So we'll have a little read of the poem first, and then I've got some visual clues today, something just to help us with our analysis. So we'll have a little look at all of the sort of themes, and we've got some quotations to have a little look at before we look at the language structure and form. Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks of shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deathly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them, wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. we turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels and shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. That is a poem really worth reading out loud several times, because you'll notice when you're reading it, and I noticed this when I was reading it, that it really is a very sensory poem. There's a huge amount of sound and sound techniques used by Wilfred Owen, and that is all part of this idea that war poetry like this attempts to reach through to the reader's senses. So when we're reading this poem, you should have a pen ready to underline the repetition of sounds. So one of the most noticeable things in terms of that sound and the structure is the repetition of the line, but nothing happens, which is very abrupt compared to a lot of the sibilant and soft alliteration that we hear through the poem, and the sibilants that we hear as well. So we've got but nothing happens, and then some kind of questions as well. So these rhetorical questions: what are we doing here? Is it that we are dying? And then that one stanza which is slightly different: for love of God seems dying. And it's worth thinking about why, in terms of that refrain, it changes each time, and reading lots of meaning into that final line. So the sounds are really, really important, but let's just begin with the theme of futility, the futility of war. So first thing that you ought to be thinking about, maybe writing down some notes about, is whether or not you think Poppies and War Photographer are trying to show that war is futile as well, that it's pointless. Because we had the kind of powerless mother, she was powerless to help her son. We had the powerless war photographer who couldn't do anything to help the husband and his wife when he's taking photographs. He looks at her helplessly, and all he can do is kind of take that snapshot. We've got that line in the third stanza about the blood staining into foreign dust. We would expect a soldier to have some sort of control or power, like he's a fighter, he's there to change the way that war, change what happens in war. But actually what Wilfred Owen shows us is that the soldier feels powerless as well. So the idea of the futility of war is important. It suggests that war is kind of pointless, that it doesn't achieve anything. And in that sense, Wilfred Owen has what we might call a consciously political ethos. So Wilfred Owen is trying to make a deliberate political message through this poem, and we can see that straight away through the title Exposure. So the poem on a surface level is about the men suffering from physical exposure. They have been out in the wind and the snow and the cold for so long that they are beginning to die. And in the final stanza, we see the men burying their friends, the half-known faces. So in that sense, it's about the weather. But that word exposure has two meanings. It also means revealing the truth. And so the truth that Owen can be seen to be revealing here is about his attitudes towards patriotism. So we've got these themes as well. Patriotism. If you're a patriot, you believe in the kind of glory and honour of fighting for your country and in standing up for everything that you value about your nation. That other word, pacifism, is about this idea of opposing all war and finding peaceful alternatives. So sometimes around Remembrance Day, you might see somebody wearing a white poppy. And if you see somebody wearing a white poppy, that's because they are making a political statement about the fact that they think that war is wrong. They are a pacifist. And the white poppy is there to kind of commemorate the people who've given their lives, so to show respect to soldiers and the military, but also to kind of make that other statement of, whilst I respect the loss of life and whilst I don't want to dismiss what they fought for, I also want to stand up for more peaceful alternatives to war. And in that sense, Wilfred Owen in this poem should be seen as a pacifist. He sort of refers to himself as a kind of conscientious objector. Even though he went to war, he morally thought that war was wrong and that all killing is wrong. And we can see that in this quotation from a letter he wrote to his mother. Thus you see how pure Christianity will not fit in with pure patriotism. So in that letter, he's describing how he doesn't feel as though you can morally fight and also sort of see yourself as a Christian. His belief has been shattered by what he's seen in war. And that's really important in exposure, because we have that question, for love of God seems dying. So does that mean that these men, all of the soldiers, are losing their faith? Does it mean that we are losing our faith in God as a society? Is it kind of posing those bigger questions? And that's really important, because we should think about the zeitgeist of the world before World War One, of the kind of Victorian Edwardian society, in which social hierarchy was really important, in which there's a lot of respect for authority, and the post-World War II zeitgeist. So zeitgeist means, literally in German, Zeit, which is time, and Geist, which is feeling. So the feeling of the time. So that kind of post-World War II zeitgeist of liberal democracy. So the idea that society should value diversity and justice and fairness through questioning authority figures. So if you think about post-World War II, we become a lot more doubtful about religion and organised religion as a society in the UK in particular, or Europe. We think that politicians should be more accountable. That's when you get the welfare state, the nanny state being created to kind of support people a lot more. So World War One and World War Two did make us doubt previous beliefs, and we can see that in this poem. Another little thinking point for us, the survival and life. So survival and life as a religious as well as a political question. So it's whether or not through that title exposure, Wilfred Owen is trying to expose the fact that politicians are sending soldiers off to war, and these soldiers aren't even able to achieve anything. They're just being treated like, and the phrase that is used quite a lot in terms of what happened to soldiers in the trenches of World War One is that they were cannon fodder. And so if you research things like the Battle of the Somme, you'll hear accounts about the fact that these soldiers were just being mown down by this new technology and machinery. So the machine guns, for example, and the tanks, and the fact that this form of warfare just completely shattered our belief in humanity, in being humane. So in that sense, Wilfred Owen should be seen as a poet who shows his moral indignation through anger and satire. So that word indignation, that he feels indignant morally, like he just thinks it's wrong that people are dying, but that he's also satirizing war and those attitudes of the politicians who are sending them off to war. So that's why I've got that quotation at the bottom. This is the title of one of Wilfred Owen's other poems. So dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. That's Latin, and it means it is right and just to die for your country. And in that poem, dulce et decorum est, Wilfred Owen is mocking this idea that it's right and glorious to die for your country by showing all of the physical horrors through the recreation of physical horror. So anything which is really, really violent and really graphic. A little bit like we had some kind of graphic vocabulary in War Photographer, where it's talking about the blood and it's talking about the children running in a nightmare heat. It's very emotive. So on the one hand, Wilfred Owen's poem is about a loss of life. It's about the death of these soldiers, but it has a bigger question, which is about the loss of faith and those Christian values and the values of that pre-World War I society. I'm going to stop this video before I do a separate video for language, structure and form.